not products, that makes you sound like you're like a widget. But they have come through the School of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and I've been Christian's thesis advisor, Andrew's academic advisor, and Christian's academic advisor, and Andrew's thesis advisor is here as well, which is Miss Amy Dunlop, who's worked alongside him, as well as Dr. Minto, who's also worked alongside Andrew quite a bit as well. So without further ado, Andrew Castillo.
Yes! All right, let's make this thing do what it does. Technology hates me. So he said, no, I don't want power off. That's okay.
Push the middle button.
Middle button. Middle button's the answer. There we go! All right. Well, good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Good
How are you
evening.
guys doing?
Better now that you're here.
My feelings.
Thanks, Rick. No! Okay,
Sorry.
if I get too tired, this is just going to turn into stand-up comedy, so let's not do that. I am here to talk about the fact that I am a crazy person, and I did a really, really long senior project. So the title of this is Blood Covenant and Reclaiming True Magic. And the title of that comes from the two halves of my project. The Reclaiming True Magic is the academic portion of my senior project, and Blood Covenant is the creative part of my senior project. And we're going to be talking them in the opposite order that they are listed in the title, mainly because I think that sounds better. What can I say? There we go. My senior project, I just explained to you, it's quite an endeavor. So it has the challenges of both being academic and creative. The problem with it is you can't just sit around and wait for the muses to happen. Because you're on a schedule and you need to turn it in by the end of the semester, and it needs to be beautiful, and you need to, not have strange continuity errors, and you need to, not misspell your main character's name 4 times.
Yeah.
So what are they? They are a 19-page research paper on the relationship of fantasy and Christianity, and an 178-page, as of current, novel being edited about the nature of magic and the inescapable longing for home. And we are going to unpack all these things. Also, my little clicker is flashing, so either it's about to die or it will explode. Either way, I apologize. All right, so why did I do this to myself? I did this because 3 specific reasons. One, I knew from my freshman year that I wanted to do a study on fantasy literature. I am fascinated by it. It is what I spend my time doing and reading and experiencing and arguing about. But in reading more modern books, in reading more modern interpretations of magic, I was very disappointed because I felt like magic had lost its magic. Fantasy had lost its fantasy. And so I wanted to write a book that didn't. So I want to look for a romantic postmodern reclamation of the ideal of fantasy. And when I say postmodern, I mean existing in the postmodern period. And when I say romantic, I mean stemming from the Romantic period, which is where we get the genesis of many of our classical fantasy ideas that we now consider classic, even though they're not part of the classical period. That makes total sense. And also an exploration of the universal journey home. This is an idea that many schools of literary criticism have thought of is the idea of the universal journey. It is especially synonymous with the psychoanalytic school, but it returns in a lot of the more structured literary criticisms that focus on symbology through the text. And the journey home is something that we experience both as humans, as Christians. Our souls experience a final journey home, and it is a universal idea that all mythologies seem to have some concept of characters searching for home. So those are the big ideas. These are the big ideas that are going to impact. These are the backbone of why I'm so tired. All right, so the paper. So this is the paper that I wrote on. So there are 2 main points to this paper. There is the idea of fantasy in the Christian tradition and the nature of magic, and what is magic. So fantasy in the Christian tradition, we have these 2 sort of ideas. We have fundamentalism and we have subcreation. And these are two ideas that are going to generally be opposed. You have sort of the idea of the fundamentalism of the stripping down of ideas, the stripping down of a religion, which is something that we experience in Christianity through fundamentalism, which is opposed to subcreation. This is a term that was, I'm not sure it was invented, but it was at least popularized by J.R.R. Tolkien. And Tolkien believed that as humans, being made in the image of God meant that we were given the ability to create in our essence, and that we had a natural calling, a natural duty to create. And when that creation was done in an act of discovery and sacrifice and humility, that was serving your imago Dei. That was serving your image of God, in that you were making something that was beautiful and that pointed towards God. This also continues on to fantasy is the natural enemy of narrow-mindedness. Fantasy is going to be naturally opposed to fundamentalism, iconoclasm, and post-structuralism. As fantasy, the idea of myth is a very classical. It's very classical. It's a very structuralist idea. It is a unifying idea. It is the idea that all people, all nations, all traditions have a central set of codified thinking. Christian, you talked about this, the idea of myth. And even we as Christians, we have our own myth, that C.S. Lewis would call it the one true myth. We have the Christian myth, the capital M myth. And that is the fact that God communicates to us in mythic language. He teaches us, he speaks to us in narrative form. And that is why the calling of the writer is so high to Tolkien and to Lewis, is that we are communicated, wow, that was a great sentence, that God communicates to us. Keep things active. There's my advice to the people who have to do their senior presentations yet. Keep your tenses active. That is the way that God communicates to us through narrative. And the primary authors that I talked about are C.S. Tolkien. Wow! I'm off to a great start. J.R.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, and the oft-overlooked George MacDonald, who I think is quite possibly the most important of these three. And then the nature of magic. So from these three great authors, we get a nature of magic that I will continue to explore throughout this presentation. But they introduce three very important concepts. The first and most important is the idea of the deeper magic. The deeper magic I will talk about once we get to C.S. Lewis, but this is a backbone of why these authors write the way they do. Then there's the subversion of magic. The subversion of magic is something that I address in the paper. This is, you see a lot of authors, especially starting in the 60s, reaching its peak in the 1980s with the popularity of Salman Rushdie's fairy tales. We see a postmodernization and a mechanical inclination of fantasy that has not gone away and results in a flawed deconstruction of the idea of myth, and that also leads to the postmodern failure of magic, which again reaches its peak in the 1980s. Since then, we have seen some pushback from the metamodernist movement, but then again, the metamodernist movement has its own problems with fantasy. So these are the masters. George MacDonald, C.S. Lewis, and J.R.R. Tolkien, and they each bring a very important idea to the table. I have a pointer, and I'm going to use it. Okay, so George MacDonald. First of these ideas is George MacDonald. He was an Anglican priest. He also wrote fairy tales, and he had a epic beard. I could not find a suitable picture for it. It came down to about here by the time he was done.
Oh, wow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. He looks like a wizard, and he's very cool. So one of the most important ideas from MacDonald is the idea of destroying humdrum. Now, what is humdrum?
The boring, the routine, the humdrum.
Wrong! Humdrum is a person. So in his story, The Light Princess. The Light Princess is a fairy tale that George MacDonald writes. In this story, there is a beautiful princess. And it's very interesting because we get to see a very departure from what we'd think of as classic European fairy tales as it goes on. But this girl is cursed by her aunt. Her aunt is a witch, and this girl loses any sense of gravity. So she floats, but she also loses any weight of emotional gravity. She becomes a hollow person who basically, she floats around and giggles. Everything amuses her. She has no depth. Until finally, she's in a situation that she can't escape from. There's this heroic guy who's been trying to woo her. He sacrifices himself heroically, and through that, we see the second half of the fairy tale is her learning how to have gravity again, emotionally, putting back together a muted character, and giving that character an inner voice again. So it's a very non-typical fairy tale. But during this, in this fairy tale, the king calls these two, what MacDonald calls metaphysicians, Humdrum and Copycat. And these are two guys who they strut around, they use all these big words, and they accomplish absolutely nothing. The sort of their outgoing thing is, they come with this idea of basically they're going to do a medieval lobotomy, and that's their solution. And the king's like, no, you're smart, but this is a terrible idea. So this is the idea of destroying Humdrum, and I have note cards for this because I have quotes. So this is, okay, we're gonna come back to MacDonald, but this is, because Tolkien later says that the magic of fairy. Now this is fairy spelled this way. This is not fairy, F-A-I-R-Y, and F-A-E-R-I-E. They are very, very different concepts. A fairy, with that spelled F-A-I-R, that is a little person with tiny wings who flies around and bakes you cookies. Those are elves. Complain about it later. But the idea of fairy is, Tolkien took this idea of fairy that MacDonald introduces, and he develops it into his idea of sub-creatorship and his idea of magic. And he says, the magic of fairy is not an end in itself. The virtue is in its operations. Among these are the satisfaction of certain primordial desires. One of these desires is to survey the depth and space of time. Another, as will be seen, is to hold communion with other living things. Destroying Humdrum is rebuilding the character to experience themselves and their world in an appropriate context. Tolkien goes on to say, fairy itself may perhaps most nearly be translated by magic, but it is a magic of a particular mood and power, the furthest pole from the vulgar devices of the laborious scientific magician. So we have to destroy Humdrum to get to the peculiar mood of true magic. And the other thing that MacDonald talks about is finding a home for longing. In his book Fantasies, which is a deeply influential book. This is the book that inspired C.S. Lewis to write the Chronicles of Narnia. MacDonald has this passage where the hero, he's not really a hero, he's not very heroic, but the main character, Anados, is fleeing from this tree monster. And he is protected by the beech tree, or rather the spirit of the beech tree protects him. And there's this exchange between them where she sort of gives up some of her power to protect him from this monster. And it's there's this poetic line between them, which is, I saw thee ne'er before, but I see thee nevermore. But love and help and pain, beautiful, have made thee until all my years have made thee mine until all my years are done. And I may love him for he is a man, and I am only a beech tree. MacDonald uses radical anthropomorphization. Anthropomorphization is the making human of the non-human, to allude to what Tolkien develops into this idea of participatory communion through magic. That's small c communion. I am not a heretic. Lewis, who comes along later, he takes this idea of fairy, though he does not name it such. He carries this on through his idea of creation. We see this peculiar mode of magic. Magic is more than just a wizard playing with spells. It is a mode through which the world operates and moves and lives. I think we see this most clearly in the introduction of magic to his world, when Aslan sings Narnia into existence. We see that magic is in what all things grows. It is represented as a song, and this is very important because we'll learn later. Magic is music. And he also comes with the idea of defeating subversion. And we have a repeated theme of the same subversion. And I quote Uncle Andrew, "I will not be talked to like that by a dirty little schoolboy. You don't understand. I am the great scholar, the magician, the adept, who is doing the experiment. He is treating magic as an experiment, and as a result, he will never reap the blessing of it. He is confined to the cage and returned to his own world, cut off from the blessing of magic, ridiculed by those who are blessed by magic, the talking animals, who are brought into existence. They are brought into being with a very particular directive." And this is a direct section from my paper. And to carry on the idea of the deep magic, this is putting it into the context of the world that it is created in. The deep magic is inscribed on the scepter of the emperor beyond the sea. It brings judgment to those who betray it, and both give the reason for Aslan's death. Yet his resurrection is rooted in the deeper magic. The deeper magic moves beyond the purely supernatural into the sublime and miraculous, bringing life and redemption built into the fabric of reality before the realization of that reality. It is more real, more whole, more magic. The deeper magic is a state of universal enchantment and boundless life. These spiritual hopes, spiritual hope eventually of a resurrection, of the death and burial into something better, These spiritual hopes are given narrative through the dream of the Christian writer and illustrate the ideal expression of these hopes through fantasy, thereby achieving the highest end of fantasy, the greatest escape, the escape from hopelessness into hope, because of the comforting truth expressed in the magic of fairy and the eventual overthrow of death and evil at the hands of love as expressed in magic. And that is defeating subversion. So these are the keys to building a magical system. So, well then, what can we say about magic? Magic. This is an in-character explanation that a wizard attempts to give in the text of my book. Blah, blah, blah. This is fancy. These are all fancy words. These are $10 words you are going to be pulling out in philosophy and ethics and any class taught by Dr. Dolezal. But here's the answer. This is not going to get you anywhere. Because you have a definition. You don't need a dictionary to live, do you? In terms that matter. Magic is musical. Magic requires sacrifice. Magic gives all things a voice. Magic demands love to fulfill its true end. And magic can be misused and subverted. Let us unpack. Magic is musical. What do I mean by that? If you look back in history, you see that the idea of magic is generally associated with the idea of an incantation. An incantation to say or to chant or to sing something. We see this in the creation of the worlds of both Tolkien and Lewis. Their worlds are built by singing. Why does singing matter? Why can't it be poetic? Poetic is not participatory. Poetry is a solitary activity. Music is not. Why isn't it chemistry? Chemistry is a science. Magic is an art. And that is how it is likened to music. Music has elements where it can be broken down and put into mechanical terms and studied. But that's not music, is it? mechanical study. Rhian, you are music. Am I correct?
Yep, and I'm clean to everything you're saying because I'm like, wow. Keep going, Robbie.
Thank you.
Keep going.
Secondly, magic requires sacrifice. We see a basis for this in the idea of the light princess. The way back to magic, the way to grounding in a magical, in a realer reality. That's a word. It comes through a sacrifice. It comes through the brave sacrifice of the hero of the Light Princess. It comes through the sacrifice of Aslan. They were given a window and an access to the deeper magic. Even through we see the wizards in the Lord of the Rings. Each of them gives up something for their power. Gandalf gives up sort of his freedom of going around, because he has access to magic. He must be good. He must do the impossible. We see Sauron give up his humanity in the search, or his...
In geology.
Yeah. He gives up himselfness for magicness. Magic gives all things a voice. This is that idea of the participatory communion. I have to use words with way less syllables. It gives all things a voice. That is the idea of radical anthropomorphization that comes with magic. There's a reason that the mainstays of fantasy have been fantastical creatures and talking animals and spirits of what we see around us. Not to say that those things are real. It's not to say that that there are grass spirits listening to us right now, but it gives the grass a voice because that grass is part of the creation. And magic demands love to fulfill its true end. This is tied into the idea of the deeper magic. Love is what stops magic from being subverted. Love is what stops magic from being, what, we pick it against our children reading in those blasted Harry Potter books? And magic can be misused and subverted as any blessing, as any gift. It can be misused and subverted. How many times have we seen wisdom used poorly? How many times have we seen magic, not magic, I just said that. How many times have we seen knowledge used to bad ends? I think we kind of see that every day, especially in an academic setting. There's an interesting idea, because this is one where I don't remember the name of the gentleman who wrote this article. Intriguingly enough, I believe he came out of the Indian church, but he was an academic, and he wrote about, this is where you sort of see the divide in the non-fundamentalist Christian philosophy, in the fundamentalist Christian philosophy. Magic is terrible. The word itself is evil. These books should be burned. Trust me, there are many examples of that I could show. Unfortunately, few of them are academic. They are generally popular. But in the academic tradition, you have sort of a divide between, I would say, the people who would agree with Jean Edward Veith, who is a contemporary Christian philosopher and literary critic, and this other gentleman who seemed to have quite a following. I'm completely blanking on his name right now. But he was saying that magic should only be accessible to the followers of light, and whereas Veith would agree, but he would say that it's only accessible, that true magic should only be accessible to the good characters. And that I would agree with. The deeper magic should be the undoing of evil. I don't think there's any way around it based on the basis that this is coming from. So there's a proud tradition that we have in Christianity of fantasy. Even Veith would argue that fantasy itself is rooted in Christianity. And it has a natural connection. They have an ontological. There's another Dr. Dolezal word. They have an ontological and an existential connection. And that is Veith in his book, Reading Between the Lines. He says, fantasy, by projecting the inner life and by symbolizing the intangible, will by its very nature raise spiritual issues, the battle between good and evil, the inner struggles of the mind, the contest between God and Satan for the soul. Such, wow, that's, I have really bad handwriting. Momentous truths are in the realm of the unseen, but fantasy can express them in symbolic form. This is what we see expressed throughout the texts of MacDonald, Tolkien, and Lewis. And I hope to harvest from that, especially the inner struggles of the mind. I think that is one that I think has been a little bit previously overlooked in these texts. So I hoped to add that back into a tradition that has been severely neglected. All right, the book. This is the second half of my creative project. How am I doing on time, Mr. Palladino?
You're 25 minutes in.
25 minutes in, okay, this is gonna be awesome. All right. All right, so Blood Covenant, what is it? It is a novel, a fantasy novel. It is part of a series. It is part one of a series. No, I am not writing a trilogy. Why? Because it is hackneyed. Don't take that the wrong way. And two, it is aimed at an adult demographic. This is not a children's book. As much as I want to write a children's book, and I have written a children's book, and Dr. Minto has read it. About honors.
Great.
Thank you. So let's talk about this. Where is it set? The setting for this book is a continent I made up called Ephraim. It is a low fantasy setting with high fantasy sensibilities. So what does that mean? Low fantasy. Magic is scarce, magic is rare, magic is precious. The conflicts often are settled along lines of law versus chaos rather than good versus evil. This is an idea that we have thanks to, it's actually something thanks to the fantasy that happens at the transition between modernism and postmodernism in the mid-1900s, is that idea of law and chaos as also being cosmic forces that are opposed to one another. This tradition is continued in Dungeons and Dragons. Oh, look, Satan hasn't appeared yet. Somebody ask me questions about that, please. And there are no humans. Why? Because radical anthropomorphization creates a level of separation with the reader so they can accept things more conceptually and more realistically that are not evidently physically apparent to us. I care about that a little bit. I drew a map. You can't see it very well. So essentially, to sum up, this is the country it happens in. This is Galewatch. Galewatch is a country. They're at the very bottom of the world. They are kind of like if Ireland and Argentina had a weird love child. That direction is north. And this is the whole continent. This is important. Why? Because this is Ephraim. Ephraim is a country and a continent, like Australia. So I'm taking all the countries, just throwing them into a blender, and this is what happened to fall out. So Ephraim is also the home of the Dominion. The Dominion, they are the, I don't want to call them the evil empire, because they're not really that evil. They're just that empire that conquers things, and they are not Romans or Nazis. I have decided to go outside the box. Actually, I based them primarily off of the Imperial Indian Society during the Caliphates, as opposed to Galewatch, which is mostly based off of ancient Irish society. And why did I choose those two? Because I think they are two of the most diametrically opposed societies, purely, if for no other reason, based on their approaches to religion and their approach to class. You have one of the absolutely most rigid class-structured societies and one of the absolute least. So essentially, to sum up, the Dominion, they're from here. They have conquered Galewatch hundreds and hundreds of years ago. They also conquered Little Eudocia up there, and they are at war with Elysia, which is this. There's this giant desert between, and they are fighting a hopeless war in the desert, and they are also fighting at sea with a rival empire across the ocean. Read as totally not England. The plot. Here are the plot hooks. Colin Westaway, the High Count of Galewatch, is dying. Ever since their empire was overthrown, they have no kings. They have 5 counts who all answer to one High Count. He is dying without an heir. His younger son is in line, and he will do anything he can possibly do to avoid handing the throne to his younger son. He does not trust his younger son, Killian. But however, his elder son, Patrick, has been exiled for a crime that he committed against the Dominion, which meant that he had to flee for his life, and his life is kind of going to heck in a handbasket at the moment. I will not tempt fate that much. The blight is back in the land. That is the second book. The blight is an illness that has spread through the country based on a misuse of magic, which has been, I'll just leave it at that. I will not, if people have more questions about that, please do ask. It is a blight in the land brought on by a misuse of magic. It had been thought to have been exterminated by a very, very brutal movement of some of the powerful mages in the land. Basically said it's either going to take over us or we're going to wipe it out. So they wiped it out in the most brutal fashion possible. And so that leaves a lot of scars on this country. And the Dominion is fighting a war they can't possibly win. The Dominion rules Gale Watch, but they are very weak. They are fighting a two-fronted war, one at sea, one at land, and they cannot win either one. They are sustaining entropy. And into this situation, we introduce our characters. I said there were no humans. This is Lady Tabitha Meagrim. She's the Archmage of Gale Watch. She is de facto the most powerful person in the country at any one time. She's the Dowager Baroness of Forcianac. She married into nobility. She is not nobility. So she has had to fight for every position that she's achieved. She's the greatest champion of the Grey Inquisition. She is the one who orchestrated the destruction of the older magical structure, which was essentially involved basically an army crushing its own people who were mispracticing magic. And that is intentionally meant to be a moral quandary. And she's the right hand of the High Count. She is the most trusted person close to Lord Colin, and she is tasked with finding his son and bringing him home with the full offer of a pardon. She is, I would say that she's a good character. She is certainly not a nice character. She is ruthless and manipulative, but she can also be creepily motherly at times. And not creepily. It's just a very jarring interaction. And this is the guy she's going to go find. This is Patrick Westaway. He changed his name to Ram when he had to hide from the Dominion. This is Lord Colin's exiled son. He and Tabitha were best friends in their childhood. They don't get along so well now. He became a sailor, and he is a prisoner at the start of this book. He has gotten in trouble for something else entirely, and Lady Tabitha must rescue him. And the final character we're introducing is the closest thing we have to a traditional hero in the story. This is Christy. She is Ram's lover. She works as a prison guard for the Dominion. She is self-educated, and she is the one who makes the Blood Covenant. She's the one that makes the title of the book, because she makes the ancient oath to Lady Tabitha that in exchange for her lover's freedom and protection, she will serve Lady Tabitha as her knight. And that Blood Covenant is how she gets involved, and how this whole story begins to unfold between these characters as they wade forth into a very, very, very broken world. Closing remarks. Keep your fantasy fantastic. Home is where your longing finds itself satisfied, and that is where magic takes you. I'd like to do a special thank you for those who made this possible. First and foremost, Gabrielle Soulard, my beautiful girlfriend, as well as the world's greatest editor. My document is covered in pink and red and orange.